Alright, so among the many interesting things that got released with Type Moon Ace Volume 15, they have now given us an official version of a Fate timeline flowchart. They took their own stab at it, something that the community has been doing for years. So I'm just gonna go through everything real quick. To make it less confusing, we'll divide it up into sections. We're gonna go straight down the middle, starting off with the first Holy Grail War, and we've brushed over this. It wasn't an actual war, it was more so a panel of negotiations between the Einsburns, the Makiri, and the Tosakas, trying to decide who's going to do what and how exactly things were going to play out. From later years, we know that Zelrech got involved to be a mediator of the clock tower, and as far as the fight itself, it was the only war without an actual battle because it ended before it got to that point. Second Grail War, they actually began the summoning, but they had no way to control the servants, so it ended up being the servants doing whatever they wanted. They spilled blood all over the place, and they had to go back to the drawing board and find a way to keep control of the situation while the servants were present. And this will be the point where Zokin started to develop the command spells, which we would later see throughout the other wars. The Third Grail War is the one that's the most defining. Now that they had the command spells in place, this is the one that turned into an actual war. Given works like Hollow Ataraxia and Fate Apocrypha, we know that the Edelfelts were present, and given the nature of the war itself, someone from the clock tower, someone from the church. In the main timelines, you had the Einsburns try to cheat the system in order to make sure that they won. And this is where everything went sour because they ended up summoning Angramanyu in the Avenger class, a brand new extra class alongside the 7 that wasn't supposed to exist. And they ended up summoning him instead of summoning Berserker, who was supposed to guarantee them victory, but instead ended up being terrible in combat. So they ended up losing, and his evils polluted the Grail from there on out, something that didn't get discovered until the next war over. The fourth war goes down. Once again, the Einsburns really want to find a way to secure victory, so they ended up hiring Kiritsugu to go into the war for them. Kiritsugu actually pulls this off, and with proper planning, he was able to win the war above all doubts and calculations that everybody else may have made. But then he finds out that the Grail was tainted from the war that came before. So going against everything that he stood for, he decides to give it up and ended up destroying the Grail near the end of the war. We go into the Fifth Grail War, and because of the fact that Kiritsugu destroyed the Greater Grail in the Fourth Grail War, this caused the curses of Angra to flood throughout a certain part of the city, which is the same location where Shiro's old family used to exist, and he ended up becoming an orphan because of it. He falls under the care of Kiritsugu and ends up adopting his ideals, or at least his own version of Kiritsugu's ideals, before Kiritsugu finally passed away, which would later lead him into the Fifth Grail War and being a contender against the same families that were left from before. Shiro ends up doing the exact same thing. He wanted to get rid of the Grail himself, but Illya stopped him and ended up sacrificing herself in order to keep him alive with her incomplete version of the third magic, putting him into a vessel of Toko, and that way he could continue on. You have the El-Melloi case files, which is a timeline where the Fifth Grail War didn't happen, and it instead hones in on the adventures of Waver, who had ended up surviving the Fourth Grail War. Because of what he did in the Fourth Grail War, he ends up taking on the position of Canaan, becoming El-Melloi II in the place of Rhinus because she was too young to take on the position, holding the title for her, so to speak. In his timeline, you have a lot of focus on the politics of the actual clock tower, more so getting into the inner workings of the Mages Association, things like Rail Zeppelin, hidden secrets like the spiritual tomb of Albion that's beneath the clock tower, and then him exploring a bunch of jobs alongside his students like Gray, Flat, Veen, so on and so forth. And then of course, in between these jobs, you have them slowly weaving out the narrative of the main antagonist, Dr. Heartless, who wants to bring back the Age of Gods, which Waver and his group continued to solve, and they ended up taking down his master plan in the end. You have Hollow Ataraxia, which serves as the sequel to Fate Stay Night. It's more like the Fifth Grail War 5.5. It takes place after the events that occurred in Stay Night, but it tackles a different side of the story where it follows Bazette, who, as we know, was attacked before the war started and ended up losing her position. And through this, she ends up going off into a dream sequence where Einherjar becomes her servant, possesses his idea of Shiro, and then they begin to show us different events from the Third Grail War using the Fifth Grail War as the foundation. Ultimately, Einherjar ends up releasing himself from the dream and saving Bazette's life because she was in a fatal position at the time, and gives her a reason to go on. We circle back around to case files once again, and then you have the dismantlement of the Holy Grail, which in that case was provided by Waver, Ren, and some of the others from the clock tower. Going over into the left side, you have Fate Apocrypha. This is one that's a lot more known, where you had Darnik seize the Grail around the time of the Third Grail War, and this caused a complete divergence that led into the Great Holy Grail War that summoned two sides of servants. This led to the intervention of the ruler class to come in and be a mediator for the war because things had deterred on such a high level. There's also another huge divergence, that being Amakusa replacing Einherjar as that specific servant that was summoned to derail the war. Instead of Shiro being Avenger, he was also summoned in the ruler class. He had a goal very similar to the Einsburns, where he wanted to materialize the soul, and so he had survived for 70 years and finally took the Grail in the war from Darnik, and nearly achieved this before Sig was able to finally stop him, claiming that this was stagnation of humanity itself. You have Fate Labyrinth, which goes over an older duo in a different setting, more so of a dream sequence. You have Monica, the same Monica from Fate Prototype. She's actually Proto-Illya, and she goes throughout the subcategory war alongside her servant Saber via possession, and she's hopping through a bunch of timelines and weaving together events with different characters that came after her. And then you have Fate Lost Einherjar, one of the most recent additions, of course going off the same background of Fate Apocrypha that centers on Raymina, who used to be a part of the El-Melloi family, and she ended up branching off and going her own way to rekindle the family name. And this ended up being the first dual war, the doubles category Grail War, where you can summon two servants instead of one, and it more so functions like a tournament more so than an actual war. Fate Requiem, which is a timeline that's completely dislocated from the rest, that takes place 20 years after the Stay Night War in a different world entirely. This follows Eris going into the after Holy Grail War. In the case of Eris, she's actually the result of a human and a servant birthing a child, so she has very unique components as a main character. She's been imbued with powers and obligations to take down servants that step outside the rules. Everybody can summon a servant now, so with over 30 Grail Wars happening at the same time prior to the story, it's plunged Earth into World War III. You have Fate Prototype Fragments, which is a prequel to the actual Fate Prototype that goes over the first Tokyo Holy Grail War, and then you have Fate Prototype itself that goes over the second Tokyo Holy Grail War. In the first war, you have Monica summon King Arthur, and the reason being is she wants to use his power to manifest something great, which by the end of the war we find out that this was actually a beast, the beast of 666, something that Arthur couldn't allow her to do. And although she was the one that summoned him, he ended up being the same one that had to take her down, and he took down what had been summoned of the beast at that point in time as well. You get off into the second war, and Monica actually resurrects under the same notion, and she uses her powers and revive the former servants for the war. So instead of it being a normal war like it was in Prototype Fragments, it ends up being more so like Fate Apocrypha and Fate Strange Fate, where it's a 7-on-7 scenario. The resurrected servants from the last war, and then the new servants would come into this war. Naturally, this was the prototype, the original version of Stay Night, so it does have its own section away from everything else, considering that it's not supposed to really lead into anything officially. Going over into the next series, you have Fate Strange Fate, which considers that the 4th and the 5th Grail War did occur, and actually presents us with one of the latest wars. It takes place around 2009. This would function as a 6th Grail War, but on a technical level, since the Grail Wars are supposed to take place in Fuyuki, it would actually be the 1st Grail War that takes place in America, where you have people like Prelati, Faldeus, and the US government weave together a plan to reach the other side using Fuyuki's outlines from the Grail Wars before as their foundation. Getting off into 2015, you have Fate Grand Order, which follows its own version of the Fate Stay Night timeline, that being Marsberry and Solomon taking part in the 5th Grail War instead of us following Shiro. And the United Nations would then contract the organization that is Chaldea to satisfy the safekeeping of humanity altogether by the use of their advanced technology that allows them to hypothesize the future, view into the past, and then transport from the present in order to fix any life-altering divergence. And then you have the Extraverse. This includes Fate Extra CCC, its sequels, Fate Extella, and then Extella Link. This is yet another divergence that stems more so from around the Fate Zero timeline, where the magical energy in the world started to dry up in the 1970s, something that was alluded to happening because of a ritual by the dead apostles, and then it resulted into a state where the world itself was dying out, leading very similar into a situation like Notes. In that world, there is a bunch of strife, wars, the world is owned by the Harways, the Western plutocracy, and this has plummeted majority of the big nations on Earth into chaos and wars with each other. This ramps up our position in the timeline, where the main character is actually in the cryogen and their data has been transported through a supercomputer that we never knew about, that is able to analyze and use Earth's information and create its very own world on the moon itself. This leads us into the Moon Cell Holy Grail Wars, and then in the sequel, Fate Extella, you have Archimedes trying to bring about a great calamity using the Zero Dark, which ends up leading us into the discovery of the White Titan Safar as well as the other Velbers. We only end up going against one, that being an avatar of Safar itself. Same Safar that attacked Earth 14,000 years ago was able to manifest via using Altera as its avatar, and that is because Altera herself is recognized as an alien existence of that world due to her connection with the god of war Mars. And then for Fate Extella Link, it follows the same premise as Fate Extella, but this time around it focuses more on a power struggle between the fictional Charlemagne and the real Charlemagne. They both get summoned as two different counterparts. Things that aren't on this list, series like Fate type Redline, I find it kind of weird that it's not on the list, considering that Lost Einherjar came after and it made it, but hey, that's their call. Things like Fate Kaleid, Prisma, Illya, this should also be on the list. It's not present. Not really surprised about Illya considering all the things that's going on in the story. If it was here, it would be a lot like Requiem and Extra, considering that it's so different that it might as well be its own thing. There are some others, but those are the main ones that jumped out to me.